COVID-19 pandemic has thrown a spanner into the works for almost all countries in the continental bodies. For Africa, events like the extraordinary summits on silencing of the guns has been postponed indefinitely. It was scheduled to be held this month. At the end of the year, this year was supposed to be when Africa sees the end of violence and internal conflicts. The Maghreb region and Mozambique are struggling with insurgencies, and the DRC is still at war with rebels. Cameroon is experiencing internal conflict, to name a few. The goals and targets set will have to be shifted and adapt to accommodate the new reality of living through a global public health crisis. Let's get some analysis on this, some perspective of where we are at this stage. I understand that we don't have our guest, but we were scheduled to speak to Hassan Khannenje. He's an analyst in Nairobi, to get a sense of where we are at this stage. I remember back in 2002 when the OAU transformed into the AU. I was sitting in that stadium in Durban thinking, this is such a similar moment. There were such huge expectations with regards to the AU. Has it lived up to that expectations? We'll bring in Hassan in a short while to get a perspective as to whether we have lived up to that expectations. We'll bring him in a short while. Oh, I understand Hassan is on the line with us. Hassan Khannenje, a very good morning to you.
Good morning to you. How are you today?
I am better than I deserve, and better than most people around the continent, around the world, who are grappling with this pandemic of COVID-19 as we celebrate Africa Day today. How should, first of all, let's start there. How should one celebrate this day in the midst of a pandemic?
I think that is the irony of Africa Day, because the pandemic would not have come at a worse time for the continent. Just when the continent was making progress with the peace in South Sudan, with ongoing peace process in Central African Republic, with a united front against the fight against extremism in the Sahel region, and with the political and diplomatic changes taking place in the Horn of Africa, I think the continent was looking forward to a more hopeful year in which we can finally at least bring to an end the perpetual wars and conflict. And not to mention the recent changes in the Congo that actually were very promising with regard to democratic development in a country that has known war for much of its independent history. So it's sad, ironical, but of course, it's also something that I think the continent needs to be aware that just because you've planned to move along the process of bring about peace or silence the guns does not mean other factors might not come in place. Yeah. And I think going forward, the continent needs to be more prepared for pandemics or other epidemics like this one for us to be able to make progress in the foreseeable future.
Let's look at the African Union as a body. And I was just saying earlier on that I was in that stadium when the AU was launched, the OAU transformed to the AU, and thinking that this is such a seminal moment. This could be, where we get things done. There was lots of expectations. There was an air of expectation in that stadium, one would say. But has it lived up to that expectation in terms of dealing with the issues in Africa?
I think the promise that came with the formation of the African Union has been challenged by the realities of the international system, and as well as the realities of the continent itself, the realities of governance and the realities of economics. And in some respect, the African Union has made certain progress. However, without critical reform within the institution, and without independent financing, because largely the AU depends on lots of donor support, which limits the continent's ability or the organization's ability to conduct certain affairs, to make certain interventions. And sometimes we've been, the organizations have been left to become spectators in their own affairs, which is unfortunate. And I think this is something that has to be changed if the African Union has to live up to the expectations of the African people. That were, of course, inherent in the transition from the Organization of African Unity, which had largely been seen as a toothless bulldog to African Union that had offered a lot of promise of integration and of providing African solutions to African problems.
I remember when I was covering the Libya, the unrest in Libya a couple of years ago, and the African Union came to the fore in terms of what can they do, and they came under a lot of criticism with regards to the role they played in trying to solve the issues in Libya per se. Well, how do you think that's developed in terms of their role in trying to solve such issues on the continent?
I think the failure or the perceived failure of the African Union in Libya was actually one of, I think, the biggest failures you can think about that robbed the continent an ability to solve its own problems and allowed foreigners, for instance, to come and dictate the outcome of the Libyan case, which, of course, as we know, it has meant that Libya has become perpetually a country in conflict. Today, you have competing warlords, which is unfortunate for the continent. And so for us to be taken seriously by the world as an African continent and as the African Union, there has to be a resolve and an ability to be able to conduct affairs, resolve conflict, but also mobilize resources internally instead of just relying on foreigners to be able to solve our own problems. The challenge has been sometimes within the union, leadership doesn't see eye to eye. And there is sometimes poor coordination, and frankly, we've done very little with regard to the promise of integrating the continent socially, economically, and politically to the extent where we are able to marshal enough power, whether it's economic or military, to solve our own problems. And I think that's the direction in which the continent needs to start thinking of going, because without being able to enforce certain mechanisms, to enforce certain resolutions, even in situations such as intractable conflicts, whether it's in Sudan or Central African Republic or in the Sahel region, the African Union is going to perpetually be at the mercy of foreign intervention and foreign powers, which, of course, something is not sustainable, and especially now in the post-pandemic period, which is going to make the continent even more vulnerable. And instead of silencing the guns, the likelihood of social unrest that will emerge from economic collapse may actually increase some of those conflicts.
You know, the issues that you've just laid out, does that talk directly to this year's theme, which is silencing of the guns, creating conducive conditions for Africa? What are these conducive conditions that we're talking about? Practically, how would it work? And given the timeframes, is it realistic?
First of all, silencing the guns is going to require local capacity. Regional organizations have to be made to be more robust in enforcing resolutions that the continental body arrives at. Because part of the challenge is you have a lot of propositions that are never followed through, either because of lack of political will or lack of economic resources to do that. And in many cases, it's actually both. Number two, the idea of standby forces, for instance, if it's actualized, it will go a long way in actually enforcing the silencing of guns initiative, because in the absence of that, it becomes a challenge. And finally, to enforce any, let's say, peace agreement to ensure that this initiative survives, countries or the third parties, or which in this case we're looking at the African Union, must be able to marshal economic resources to provide both incentives that can allow the parties to do that, but also allow for a form of restoration of normalcy to those countries, because it's not possible to silence the guns when there is no alternative to silencing the guns.
Dr. Khannenje, we thank you very much indeed for your time, and we appreciate your perspective. Be well.
Thanks for having me.
All right. And happy Africa Day to you. That was Dr. Hassan Khannenje, Director, Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, giving us a perspective on Africa Day and the way forward in terms of this content.